The chamber was hushed, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself was waiting to be broken. Spotlights from the press gallery sliced through the dimly lit Senate hall, bouncing off the polished wood of the witness table. Kash Patel sat forward, his hands clasped, the microphone a mere breath from his lips. The camera zoomed in, millions watching in real time. And then, without flinching, he delivered the line that sent a chill through every corner of Washington. Asterisk. Tonight, the names you thought were untouchable are no longer safe. Asterisk. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few scribbled notes furiously, as if trying to brace themselves for what was about to unfold. But no one in that room nor the countless Americans glued to their screens could escape the gravity of that moment. For years, the Epstein case had been treated like a dark shadow on the wall, acknowledged but rarely faced head-on. Powerful names whispered in back rooms, dismissed by officials, conveniently omitted by major networks. The promise of truth dangled but never delivered. Until now. Patel's tone was calm, almost steady, but beneath it pulsed the kind of conviction that cannot be rehearsed. He wasn't here to speculate. He wasn't here to protect reputations. He was here to strip away the veil of power and tell the story that too many had tried to bury. And the way he said it carried an unspoken guarantee. The silence, the cover-ups, the evasions, they were finished. On Twitter, the clip had already begun to spread, just seconds after it was spoken. He said it. One post blared, finally. Others were less restrained. This is it, the floodgates are about to open. The digital world was buzzing, electrified by the sense that something seismic was about to happen. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere thickened with unease. Staffers exchanged wary glances. A senator whispered to an aide, "Is he really going there?" But Patel didn't break eye contact with his audience. He looked out into the chamber as though he were speaking directly to every citizen who had ever wondered why the powerful never seemed to answer for anything. And with that single line, a fuse had been lit. The room didn't yet know how long the cord was or how loud the explosion would be, but everyone could feel it coming. What Patel said next would make clear. This was no ordinary hearing. This was the opening shot in a battle that would shake America's confidence in its own institutions. And it was only the beginning. Why did this moment matter? Why now, when the Epstein scandal had already been whispered about for years, when the headlines had come and gone, when most Americans had resigned themselves to the idea that the truth might never surface? The answer hung in the air that night like smoke. Because this wasn't simply a scandal, it was a litmus test for whether America still had the capacity to confront its ugliest truths, even when those truths reached into the highest towers of power. For decades, the promise of equal justice under the law has been the bedrock of the American identity. Immigrants arriving with little more than hope clung to it. Families believed in it. Activists fought and sacrificed for it. Yet every time a scandal like Epstein's crept into the light and then mysteriously retreated back into shadow, that promise weakened. Who was being shielded? Who was making sure certain names never made it into the news? And why did justice always seem to stop at the gates of the wealthy and the well-connected? That's why Kash Patel's words hit with such force. He wasn't just naming names, he was naming the hypocrisy of an entire system. The Epstein saga wasn't simply about one man's crimes. It was about networks of influence so thick, so deeply entangled in money and privilege, that even the word accountability felt laughable. It was about the politicians who took donations, the media executives who controlled narratives, the lawyers who found technicalities, and the bureaucrats who looked the other way. And Americans knew it. That's why this hearing mattered now more than ever. The country was already on edge, rocked by economic strain, political polarization, a gnawing sense that the rules are different for the rich than for everyone else. Patel's decision to sit down in that chamber and peel back the curtain spoke directly to those fears. He wasn't just talking about Epstein. He was daring to show how far the rot went, and who benefited from keeping it hidden. The suspense was unbearable. Every senator in the chamber knew that if Patel followed through on his promise, careers could be destroyed, reputations dismantled. Entire legacies tainted. Viewers at home felt it too. The thought pulsed across social media. Would he actually do it? And if he did, would those names finally face the scrutiny the public had demanded for so long? But behind those questions lurked something darker. If the system had protected Epstein for this long, what else had it hidden? How many gatekeepers had been complicit not because they agreed with the crimes, but because protecting power was more valuable than protecting people? And more chilling still, what lengths would those gatekeepers go to in order to keep the truth from ever fully emerging? The weight of history pressed in on the chamber. This wasn't just another hearing. This wasn't just about political points or partisan sparring. This was about trust itself, the fragile glue that held together the idea of America. Without trust, laws meant nothing. Without trust, institutions collapsed into hollow facades. Without trust, citizens began to ask the question that every empire dreads. Why should we obey rules that don't apply to those at the top? Kash Patel, seated in the glare of the cameras, seemed to understand all of it. His words weren't aimed at the senators across from him. They were aimed at the people watching at home. People who had waited years for someone to say aloud what they already knew in their hearts. And as the tension tightened like a rope, one realization began to dawn. This wasn't a battle between one man and his accusers. This wasn't even about a scandal that had haunted America's conscience for years. But as Patel began to unravel the threads, it became clear this wasn't just about one man. It was about a system. For years, the most powerful names in America and beyond treated the Epstein scandal as little more than background noise, an inconvenience to be brushed aside with a carefully worded press release or a cold smile before the cameras. They operated under a simple assumption that the rules were written for everyone else. They were the exception, immune to consequence, sheltered by wealth, by status, by the quiet agreements that circulate in the marble halls of influence. The elites, the gatekeepers, the insiders, they built their lives around that arrogance. Publicly, they preached values of integrity, family, justice. They attended galas, posed for photographs, shook hands with world leaders. They funded charities that wore the face of compassion. But behind the scenes, their dealings painted another story, a darker one, whispered about but never confirmed, always shielded by the machinery of privilege. It wasn't just the money, it was the control. Media executives decided which names would see print and which would vanish into editorial silence. Politicians who could have pressed harder chose instead to pivot, to bury, to claim that ongoing investigations tied their hands. Lawyers weaponized technicalities, drawing out cases until the public grew weary, until outrage was replaced with resignation. And through it all, the most powerful laughed not out loud, but in the quiet confidence of knowing they had already won. This was the hypocrisy Patel was confronting. Because while average Americans lived their lives under the constant weight of laws, fines, and punishments, those at the top lived in a different universe. A universe where connections were currency, where accountability was optional, where the only real crime was getting caught in a way that couldn't be controlled. Think of the statements we heard over the years. Polished, sanitized lines meant to signal innocence. I barely knew him. I was unaware of his activities. We crossed paths at events, nothing more. Each word chosen with surgical precision, each denial designed not to persuade the public but to buy time. And it worked because the media outlets responsible for digging deeper often chose not to. Stories were spiked, angles were softened, coverage diluted until the scandal seemed manageable again. But beneath that arrogance lay a fatal flaw. Power breeds overconfidence. The bigger the walls they built to shield themselves, the less they believed those walls could ever come down. And so, in their own way, they grew careless. They left trails, photographs, flight logs, donations, connections too glaring to ignore. They underestimated not only the persistence of investigators, but the memory of the people. And that memory was not kind. Ordinary citizens remembered the double standards, the feeling of betrayal. They remembered how scandals involving the rich never seemed to resolve with the same finality that ordinary cases did. They remembered the smirks of commentators who dismissed questions as conspiracy theories, only to later admit that pieces of those theories had been true all along. This was not the first time America had watched the powerful wriggle free of consequence, but the Epstein scandal became a symbol, a shorthand for everything broken in the system. His name was shorthand for the untouchables, for the cabal of influence that thrived in the dark. And every name connected to him carried that same taint, no matter how loudly they denied it. When Kash Patel leaned into the mic, he wasn't just preparing to challenge individuals. He was preparing to challenge a culture of entitlement that spanned decades. He was preparing to strip the mask from those who had lived double lives, publicly posing as pillars of society while privately benefiting from silence. The arrogance of the powerful had always been their greatest shield, but it would also become their downfall, because arrogance blinds. It convinces the untouchable that the ground beneath them is solid, even as it begins to crack. And when the cracks give way, when the foundation collapses, the fall is swift, brutal, and impossible to hide. That was the storm Patel was summoning into the chamber. He knew that for years, the villains of this story had laughed at accountability. He knew they believed their networks were strong enough to withstand any scandal, but he also knew something they didn't, that the appetite for truth had reached a breaking point. And in that Senate chamber, as the lights burned bright and the cameras captured every flicker of expression, the untouchables were about to discover just how fragile their untouchability really was. Because the higher you climb on false promises, the harder you fall when the truth cuts through. And Patel was sharpening the blade. What came next would not just expose arrogance. It would reveal the story of a man who had spent his life challenging power itself, and why that made him uniquely dangerous to the system he now confronted. Before Kash Patel became a name whispered in the corridors of Washington, before he sat in that Senate chamber with the weight of history on his shoulders, he was simply the son of immigrants chasing the American promise. His parents arrived with little, carving out a life through grit and discipline, instilling in their children the conviction that in America, hard work could bend destiny. For Kash, that belief wasn't just a family story, it became the compass that guided his career. He studied law, not for prestige, but for purpose. Defense work pulled him into the unglamorous trenches of justice, where the law wasn't theory but lifeline. He represented clients who had nothing, who faced systems stacked against them, and he learned quickly that power rarely yielded unless it was forced to. In those early years, he earned a reputation for being relentless. Judges noted his refusal to back down. Adversaries grudgingly respected his precision, and clients saw in him a champion who treated their struggles as his own. From there, Patel moved into national security and counterterrorism. It was a transition that seemed unlikely to those who pegged him as just another lawyer, but it made perfect sense to Kash. He wanted to protect people at scale, to apply the lessons of individual justice to the broader battlefield of American safety. He worked in intelligence, navigating a world of secrecy, misinformation, and entrenched hierarchies that prize tradition over truth. It was here that his defining quality emerged. Kash Patel was unafraid to challenge the powerful, even within his own ranks. He pushed back against narratives that didn't fit the facts. He questioned decisions that seemed motivated by politics rather than protection. He demanded accountability from institutions that were more comfortable in silence. And each time he refused to bend, he gained both enemies and admirers. Some called him reckless. Others called him brave. But to Patel, it wasn't about labels, it was about loyalty to the truth. That loyalty carried him into the heart of Washington. By the time he joined the Trump administration, Patel was no longer the outsider lawyer fighting on behalf of forgotten clients. He was an insider, positioned at the crossroads of power, navigating the sharp elbows of politics while still refusing to conform to its quiet corruption. As a senior aide and later chief of staff at the Department of Defense, he stood in rooms where global decisions were made, where whispers turned into policies, where secrets shaped futures. But what set him apart was this: he never stopped seeing himself as the outsider. He carried into those halls the perspective of someone who knew what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, written off. He didn't belong to the cocktail circuit or the legacy networks. He belonged to the idea that truth was worth fighting for, even if it meant being despised by those who guarded their fiefdoms of influence. And despised he was. To the entrenched establishment, Patel was dangerous precisely because he was fearless. He wouldn't play by their unspoken rules. He wouldn't trade silence for access. He wouldn't confuse compromise with integrity. And so, he became a lightning rod, a figure either admired for his courage or vilified for his defiance. But in either case, he could not be ignored. For progressive-leaning audiences, Patel's story reads like a paradox. He worked for an administration many of them distrusted, yet his personal journey resonates. The immigrant son who fought his way into the highest levels of government, only to turn that access against the very machine that sought to control him. He was proof that identities cannot be boxed in, that loyalty to justice is bigger than loyalty to party, and that truth has a way of finding unlikely messengers. Empathy for Patel comes not from perfection but from persistence. He stumbled, he faced criticism, he bore the weight of smear campaigns designed to paint him as reckless or untrustworthy. But through it all, he never surrendered the grit that had been forged in his earliest battles. To him, every challenge was another reminder of where he came from and of who he was fighting for. By the time Patel leaned into that Senate microphone, his life had been one long preparation. He had faced corrupt systems in courtrooms, entrenched hierarchies in intelligence, political games in the West Wing, and global crises in the Pentagon. Each experience hardened him, sharpened him, and stripped away any illusions about the cost of speaking truth to power. So when the moment came, he wasn't rattled by the weight of the chamber or the glare of the cameras. He wasn't intimidated by the senators fidgeting in their seats or the millions watching from home. He had lived his entire life as an outsider, pressing against insiders, as a challenger against systems, built to silence dissent. And that background is exactly what prepared him for the firestorm he unleashed in that Senate chamber. The hearing had begun like any other stiff, procedural, wrapped in layers of formality designed to bury more than reveal. But as Kash Patel pressed forward, that carefully constructed order began to fray. It started with a senator leaning back in his chair, voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Patel, let's stay focused on the facts. We're not here to play conspiracy games." Patel didn't flinch. He met the senator's eyes and replied evenly, "With all due respect, Senator, the facts are exactly what I'm here to deliver. It's the attempt to hide them that has become the game." The chamber shifted. Whispers ticked through the audience. The senator pursed his lips, trying to recover, but the exchange had already tilted momentum. Patel had not only countered, he had exposed the very evasiveness that kept so many Americans skeptical of these hearings in the first place. Another bureaucrat stepped in, voice oily with caution. "We can't speculate on names or associations that lack formal charges." Patel leaned toward the mic, the lighting catching the edges of his face, shadowing him like a character out of a thriller. His words were measured, deliberate. "Speculation is what happens when evidence is suppressed. Tonight I'm here to end speculation by putting the truth on the record." The room fell silent. All eyes locked on Patel. Reporters, half distracted moments earlier, now scrambled to capture every word. Cameras zoomed closer. Viewers at home, already glued to the stream, leaned forward in anticipation. Patel wasn't just answering questions, he was dismantling the very narratives that had shielded the powerful for years. A third senator tried to derail him with procedural language. "We cannot allow this chamber to devolve into rumor-mongering. Names are not—" Patel cut in, his voice calm but sharp as steel. "With respect, Senator, you call them rumors. I call them witnesses, documents, and evidence that your committees refuse to investigate. The American people deserve better than word games." The senator froze, his jaw tightening. For the first time in the hearing, his arrogance cracked. Cameras caught it. The image would circulate within minutes across Twitter and TikTok. A powerful man suddenly cornered by truth. The escalation was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. Every exchange felt like a tightening coil. Every deflection met with Patel's precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He stayed calm, surgical, while the establishment figures surrounding him grew restless, shifting in their seats, glancing nervously toward aides, as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. And the hints began. Patel never shouted them, never forced them, but his phrasing carried weight heavy enough to buckle the walls of the chamber. When you look closely at who flew on those planes, you don't just see strangers, you see household names. When you review the logs, the photographs, the meetings, a pattern emerges. And that pattern leads straight to the heart of this city. Each line was a flare shot into the night sky, illuminating just enough for the audience to see the shape of something massive waiting in the dark. The villains, once smug, now looked rattled. A senator coughed nervously into his fist. A bureaucrat shuffled papers with unnecessary force. A journalist, caught on the chamber camera, raised her eyebrows so sharply that the clip went viral within minutes. When even the press can't hide their shock? The suspense was electric. The hearing was no longer about whether Patel would name names, it was about when. And through it all, Patel remained steady. His calm was a contrast so stark it magnified the other's unease. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't rattled. He was the hunter surrounded by prey who suddenly realized the walls were closing in. The chair tried to restore order with the familiar gavel tap, but it was useless. The air itself was heavy with anticipation. Everyone in the chamber and everyone watching beyond it could feel the buildup. The tension was no longer a question of politics or procedure. It was personal, historic, inevitable. The final exchange of the segment sealed it. A senator, voice raised, barked, "Are you suggesting that members of this body are complicit?" Patel leaned in slowly, his expression calm, almost haunting in its restraint. He let the pause stretch, just long enough to turn seconds into eternity. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying the evidence leaves no room for doubt." The chamber froze. The audience at home erupted. Twitter hashtags ignited. The buildup was complete. The storm was here. The silence was suffocating. Kash Patel leaned forward, his fingertips brushing the microphone, his eyes locked not on the senators before him, but on the lens that beamed his words to millions of Americans watching at home. He drew in a breath and let the pause linger long enough for the tension to thicken, long enough for the room to realize that the moment they had been dreading or perhaps praying for was finally here. He spoke the first name. The sound cut through the chamber like glass shattering. A ripple ran through the room, audible gasps, hurried shuffling of papers, the faint but unmistakable murmur of disbelief. A senator stiffened visibly, his knuckles whitening around his pen. Patel let the reaction breathe. He didn't rush. He sat in the silence, letting the gravity of what he had just said sink in. Then, calmly, he continued. The second name. This time, the reaction was louder. Someone in the back of the chamber whispered sharply, as though unable to contain themselves. The gallery stirred, reporters exchanging frantic glances, typing furiously into their phones. On the live stream, chat windows exploded with disbelief. Did he just say that name? This is insane, he's actually doing it. Finally, someone with the guts. Patel's cadence was deliberate. He spoke not like a man rushing to reveal, but like a surgeon peeling back layer after layer of rot. Each name was delivered with precision, each pause calculated to build unbearable suspense. It was not only the names themselves that mattered, it was the fact that they were being spoken aloud, on record, in a chamber designed to protect the powerful. By the third name, the facade of control was cracking. One senator cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, as though the sound itself might drown out Patel's words. Another leaned in toward an aide, whispering frantically. But there was no escape. The cameras were rolling, and every reaction was being broadcast to a country already on edge. The live stream lit up with hashtags. Number Patel names names, number Epstein exposed, number truth on record. Twitter was ablaze. Memes already flooding timelines, one clip showing senators' stunned faces set to dramatic music, another looping Patel's calm delivery with the caption, "Fearless." Still, Patel wasn't done. He lifted his head slightly, allowing a trace of steel to edge his voice. "For years," he said, "these names have been kept out of headlines, scrubbed from reports, and shielded from accountability. Tonight, that ends." The fourth name landed like a gavel strike. The chamber erupted in whispers now, no longer able to contain itself. One reporter bolted from the room, phone pressed to his ear, knowing that a headline was already writing itself. The tension in the air was no longer just anticipation. It was panic. And Patel let them feel it. He leaned back for a moment, folding his hands, as though daring anyone in the chamber to challenge him. But no one did. The senators, the aides, the press, they all knew the ground had shifted. The unspoken truth was no longer unspoken. It was on record, undeniable, irreversible. Across the country, living rooms buzzed with the same energy. Families who had followed the scandal for years turned to one another, stunned. College students streamed reactions on TikTok, their eyes wide as they replayed the moment over and over. He actually said it. He said it out loud. For a public long starved of accountability, the moment was intoxicating. And then came the fifth name. This one drew a visible reaction from the senators themselves. One slammed a folder shut. Another raised a hand as if to object. But the chair gave no recognition. The room wasn't his to control anymore. It belonged to Patel, and to the millions listening beyond those walls. He spoke steadily, his voice never wavering. "These names have been protected not by innocence, but by influence. But influence does not erase truth." The words landed with the force of an indictment, each syllable echoing through the chamber, through the live stream, through the hearts of those who had long believed this day would never come. By now, social media was in frenzy. Commentators were already calling it the most consequential hearing in decades. Influencers clipped Patel's delivery into bite-sized reels, their captions breathless. History in the making. Celebrities weighed in, tweeting disbelief, fury, or praise. The ripple effect was instantaneous, unstoppable, a tidal wave of validation and outrage colliding in real time. Yet through it all, Patel remained calm, even solemn. This wasn't theater for him. It wasn't spectacle. It was duty. His pauses were not for drama, but for clarity, for letting each name sink deep into the consciousness of a nation that had been lied to for too long. The villains, so accustomed to arrogance, looked suddenly small, their confidence drained with every syllable. Their smirks, once weapons of dismissal, now looked brittle, nervous. They knew what the public knew. Once truth is spoken, it cannot be unspoken. Patel closed his eyes briefly, almost as if in prayer, before leaning in once more. His next words fell into the chamber with the weight of destiny. "The people deserve to know," he said, his tone steady, unwavering. "And they will." The live stream comments raced by faster than anyone could read. "This is bigger than Watergate." "Names? On record." Finally. The beginning of the end for the untouchables. But Patel wasn't finished. He had saved the heaviest name for last, the one whispered in rumors, denied in statements, shielded by layers of power thicker than any wall. And as he drew breath, the entire room seemed to stop with him. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Senators leaned forward despite themselves. The audience watching from home leaned closer to their screens, knowing instinctively that what was about to happen would mark the point of no return. The chamber held its breath. The nation held its breath. And then Patel spoke again. But the name he dropped next sent shockwaves far beyond Washington. The instant Kash Patel's words cut through the Senate chamber, the reaction was seismic. Within seconds, the hearing was clipped, captioned, and unleashed onto social media. Twitter, or X, as it now styled itself, erupted like a volcano. Hashtags trended before Patel had even left his seat. Number Truth Exposed. Number No One Above the Law. Epstein Files. One side of the internet roared with vindication. Memes poured out at breakneck speed, Patel's face superimposed on a storm tearing through the Capitol. Senators shown as deer in headlights, clips slowed down with dramatic soundtracks as if ripped from a Hollywood trailer. The hunter becomes the hunted. One meme declared, racking up 1 million likes in an hour. But not everyone was celebrating. Establishment defenders scrambled to contain the fire. Cable networks tried to steer the narrative. Some anchors downplayed Patel's statements as reckless or politically motivated. Others leaned hard into damage control, framing him as a partisan operative rather than a whistleblower. The divide was glaring. And yet, for every pundit trying to minimize the revelations, there were 10 ordinary Americans lighting up the comments section. We've been lied to for years. Finally, someone said it out loud. If they can cover up this, what else are they hiding? The people weren't just watching anymore, they were demanding answers. On TikTok, short edits of Patel's mic drop lines racked up millions of views overnight. Gen Z creators layered his words over thunderclaps and slow-motion footage of senators squirming. One video, captioned, "History being made in real time," hit 5 million plays by sunrise. Meanwhile, politicians who had once laughed off questions about Epstein found themselves cornered. Reporters hounded them in hallways. Clips went viral of red-faced senators dodging questions, their silence louder than any denial. For the first time in years, the untouchable elite looked touchable. And then came the ripple effect. Across dinner tables, break rooms, and classrooms, everyday Americans debated what they'd seen. Parents asked why their children's schools still celebrated figures connected to Epstein. College students organized late-night live streams, dissecting Patel's every word. Uber drivers, grocery clerks, and veterans found themselves in the same conversation. If Kash Patel could say it in the Senate chamber, why had no one else dared to? The political establishment scrambled. Some leaders issued carefully worded statements, vowing full transparency, though their tones betrayed panic. Others stayed silent, hoping the storm would pass. But silence in the social media age is its own scandal, and screenshots of no-comment responses spread like wildfire. Cable news split into battle lines. One network plastered the chyron, Patel oversteps, irresponsible accusations in Senate. Another countered with, bombshell heard around the world. Are elites finally exposed? The narrative tug-of-war was fierce, but it only fueled the audience's hunger for truth. And through it all, Kash Patel's calm delivery echoed in the public consciousness. His voice had become a rallying cry. Unlike the shouters and grifters who often dominated headlines, Patel's restraint made his revelations hit harder. Viewers replayed his pauses, his unflinching eye contact, the way senators shifted in discomfort as he spoke. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. In living rooms across America, families leaned forward during news recaps, their trust in institutions hanging by a thread. College students shared clips in group chats with captions like, "This is bigger than Watergate." Veterans nodded, remarking that this was why they had always mistrusted the chain of command. Even apolitical citizens, who usually tuned out Washington drama, couldn't ignore it. The fallout was global. Foreign outlets picked up the story, framing it as America's reckoning with its own hypocrisy. European papers asked how long the U.S. could lecture others about transparency when its own elite seemed shielded. The world was watching, and Washington knew it. But the most haunting shift wasn't in the news cycle, it was in the air, a sense that the old walls of secrecy had finally cracked, that maybe, just maybe, the untouchables weren't untouchable anymore. And yet, for all the noise, one chilling silence remained. The names themselves, now teased, hinted, and all but confirmed, hung like storm clouds on the horizon. Americans wanted to know, would they actually be revealed in full? Would justice come for the powerful at last? Or would this moment, like so many before, be buried under procedure and delay? The question swelled across screens, headlines, and conversations until it was deafening. And yet, the biggest question remained, what happens to those names now? When the chamber finally settled, when the echoes of Patel's words no longer reverberated off marble and oak, a silence hung heavy, different from the silence of fear, different from the hush of shock. This was the silence of realization. Patel leaned forward once more, his tone steady, his cadence deliberate, as if he understood the weight of the moment. This isn't just about one man. It isn't even about a list of names. This is about the soul of our nation. It's about whether America still belongs to the people or whether it has been sold to the highest bidder behind closed doors. The words struck with the force of a hammer. Senators shifted uneasily. Cameras captured every flicker of discomfort. For years, secrecy had been the currency of power. But now, Patel was reminding the nation of a different currency, accountability. He continued, "We cannot teach our children that honesty matters, that dignity matters, while we let corruption hide in plain sight. We cannot tell them that no one is above the law, while the powerful laugh at the rules everyone else must follow." The American promise has never been perfection. It has always been accountability. And accountability starts tonight. Those in the gallery leaned forward, as though they were witnessing more than testimony. This wasn't mere politics. It felt like a national reckoning distilled into a single voice. Patel's words weren't firebrand rhetoric. They were something deeper. He wasn't shouting. He was reminding Americans of who they believe themselves to be. Courage against corruption, truth against lies, the people against the powerful. In America, he said, pausing so the cameras caught every breath. No one is above the law, at least. Not if we refuse to stay silent. It was a line destined for textbooks, destined to be replayed in classrooms, destined to be printed on placards and shared endlessly online. Not because it was clever, but because it felt true. It touched the core of the American identity, that fragile, defiant belief that dignity belongs to everyone, not just to those who can buy it. And then he went further. This hearing isn't just about uncovering names. It's about uncovering ourselves. Do we still have the courage to face the truth even when it makes us uncomfortable? Do we still believe in justice even when it threatens those we once admired? Do we still have the will to protect the innocent even when the guilty are powerful? The room held its breath. Outside those walls, millions watching at home felt the same stillness. It wasn't just history being reported. It was history being lived. And in that cinematic close, Patel wasn't just a witness. He was a mirror, reflecting back to Americans the choice that lay before them. And so, the night that began with a single sentence, "Tonight, the names you thought were untouchable are no longer safe," will be remembered as more than a hearing. It was a breaking point. A moment when truth cut through the marble walls of power. When Kash Patel refused to bow to silence, and when the country was reminded that justice is not a privilege of the powerful, but a promise to the people. This was never just about Epstein. It was never just about a list of names whispered in secrecy. It was about the deeper question. Can America look itself in the mirror and admit that the very institutions meant to protect the innocent have, for too long, shielded the guilty? The answer depends not on the elites, not on the politicians scrambling tonight, but on us, on ordinary people who refuse to let this story be buried, on citizens who know that silence is complicity and who understand that democracy cannot survive without truth. So here's the charge to you. Don't just watch history, carry it forward. Share this story so others can see what they were never meant to see. Subscribe so you never miss the voices that break through the noise, that refuse to let corruption hide in the shadows. And most of all, be part of the movement that says, "We will not look away." Because in the end, this isn't about Kash Patel. It isn't about senators or pundits or even the headlines racing across your screen tonight. It's about justice. It's about dignity. It's about building a future where no name, no matter how big, is above accountability. And together we can make sure that future arrives.